24 minutes to 9. Relations between the Andrews State Labor Government and the Turnbull Federal Coalition Government have never been good. But it looks as if in a state election year, and as we head towards a federal election as well, serious efforts are being made to try and mend some of those bridges. We'll come to the Rorts for Votes issue with the Victorian Treasurer in a moment. But first up today, the Federal Minister for Infrastructure is Paul Fletcher. He's a former Optus CEO and one of the rising stars in federal Liberal politics. Mr Fletcher, good morning to you.
Good morning, John. Good to be with you. And I should just clarify, former Optus senior executive, never chief executive, I'm sorry to say.
Oh, look, I've just promoted you. There you go. You should be grateful and grab it with both hands. Look, everyone seems to be in agreement now, including Matthew Guy, the leader of the Victorian opposition, that Victoria doesn't get its share of federal infrastructure and we get dudded. Here's what he said just the other day. Have we got the audio? We don't. Well, we'll come to that some other time. Even Matthew Guy concedes that Victoria's not getting its fair share of infrastructure. The figures that I've been supplied by the Victorian government say that New South Wales, $411 per capita on infrastructure, Victorians, $105. What's going on?
Well, if you look at the total amount that's being spent on Commonwealth funding for infrastructure in Victoria, 2013-14 to 2020-21, that's $8.5 billion. Now, that includes $3 billion for East West Link. That's money
which the Victorian government won't build. They were elected on a promise not to build it. Do you respect that?
But there is money there that's available for any Victorian government that wants to provide it. Look,
for that project which the Victorian people voted on.
The point I'd make is that there are often disputes between the Commonwealth Government and state governments about infrastructure projects. We provide our funding for specific projects. We don't provide a general bucket and say spend the money as you would choose. In fact, this is what Anthony Albanese, then Labor Federal Infrastructure Minister, said in 2011, quotes, "We have a right to determine where our funding is allocated. What the Commonwealth doesn't do is say, here's a pot of money, use it however you want." So the key point here is that what we want to do is work with the Andrews government to agree the projects that will come up, remembering there are significant lead times in infrastructure. And that's why, for example, in the 2016 election, we proposed $15 million towards planning for North East Link. And our logic was, if we're involved in the planning, it then becomes much easier for us to then commit substantial funding.
But it's even causing tensions, as I said, within the Liberal Party. Here's Matthew Guy.
Victoria has been a donor state for far too long. You know, we've been a net contributor to every other state since Federation.
So even within Liberal circles now, they recognise they have to start, in a way, complaining to their Liberal federal counterparts or their dead meat at the state election in November.
Well, I understood Mr Guy's comments to be about GST. And look, I understand that state leaders will always want to make the case for their state. That's their job. On the GST, as you know, there's a review underway and the final report will come out in May. So I'll leave it to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to comment in relation to that. In relation to infrastructure, the point I'd make in Victoria is a couple of things. Firstly, we have provided significant funding. We provided $1.5 billion in 2016 for a whole range of projects, including $500 million towards the Monash Stage 2. Now, it's taken...
There's no argument that you don't... No one's saying you don't give anything. The point is you don't give nearly as much. New South Wales gets $1 billion a year more. So the Prime Minister's from New South Wales, the Deputy Prime Minister's from New South Wales, the Treasurer's from New South Wales, you're the Infrastructure Minister, you're from New South Wales. New South Wales is $1 billion a year, every year, up on Victoria, per capita, 4 times per head of population.
And so the first point I'd make is the Victorian government, the Andrews government, has taken too long to put to work the money that we have provided. So we provided in April 2016 $500 million towards Stage 2 of Monash. It took until last weekend for the Andrews government to go out and announced that Stage 2 was proceeding. We're pleased they did that. It's a shame they didn't tell us in advance, but we will get on and assess the business case as quickly as possible so that money can get to work. But the next thing I'd say is there is a lead time with infrastructure projects, and the best way to work is if the Commonwealth Government and the State Government are working together so that we can plan, so that when we get the plan, we are then well placed to provide funding.
Because if you want to work together, surely the $3 billion that you and your colleagues keep tying up for the abandoned East-West tunnel has to be redeployed. Full stop, surely.
And so the approach we're taking is seeking to work with the Andrews government on long-term planning of projects. That's why we committed $30 million for Melbourne Airport Rail Link in the last budget, and I'm pleased to say that we are now working together towards planning for Melbourne Airport Rail Link.
What is the $30 million versus $3 billion?
But my point is, John, that what we need to do is first do the planning work, because these are multi-billion-dollar projects. We need to make sure that there is an alignment as to what the project is. When the Andrews government came in and cancelled an existing multi-billion-dollar project, that's a hole that takes a while to fix. Now,
it's 3 years
What we are wanting to do is identify the next round of projects. That's why we allocated funding money for North East Link. That's why we allocated funding money for Melbourne Airport Rail Link.
But I still don't have an answer to that one point. There's $3 billion earmarked for Victoria, tied up in it's in a no-go zone. It's catch-22. You guys keep saying it's for a project that the state government insists they're not going to build. Why can't you, with the stroke of a pen, reallocate that money to one of the other, and there are any number of them, one of the other projects underway in Victoria?
Because we support East West Link and we want that project to proceed, and the money is available for any government that wants to proceed with it.
Do you recognise the vote of the people of Victoria?
Can I just make the point? That's not a Victorian-only issue. We've taken exactly the same approach with a project called Perth Freight Link in Western Australia. But separately, we are engaging on other projects. So just 2 weeks ago, my colleague Michael McCormack, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, joined with Jacinta Allen, the Victorian Minister, to commit an extra $135 million towards North East Rail, taking the total Commonwealth contribution for Victorian Regional Rail to now over $1.5 billion. And I'm very pleased, as is Michael McCormack, that we were able to reach agreement on that.
Sure,
and that we've reached agreement on inland rail.
So how long does the $3 billion
John,
on East
can I make
West,
one other point?
How long does it stay locked away?
That money is available to any Victorian government that wants to proceed with that project.
So you're playing with that Victorian money to help Matthew Guy to the next state election?
Not at all. What we are doing...
Well, what else could you possibly have as a reason for leaving it frozen?
What we are doing is saying, as a national government, as a federal government, when we invest billions of dollars of Commonwealth taxpayers' money, we do that having a regard to policy priorities, to make our cities work more effectively, and it's our judgment that there is a need for East West Link to significantly reduce congestion, improve traffic moving around Melbourne, and that's why the federal coalition, Liberal MPs in Melbourne, have been making the case for East West Link, as has the Victorian opposition Liberal team here.
There's this fundamental disconnect. You and your colleagues, whether state or federal, are continuing to argue for a project that the people voted on. Tony Abbott said the last state election in Victoria was a referendum on East West. It was a referendum in Tony Abbott's mind.
And, John, we're able to do two things at the same time. We strongly support East West Link. The funding is available there for any Victorian government that wishes to proceed with it. We are also working and ready to work with the Andrews government on other projects and working on the long-term planning. But it is important that the Andrews government sits down and works with us, because it is much easier for us to provide the funding for these substantial projects if we've been involved in the planning. And that's why, for example, with something like North East Link, it's disappointing that the Andrews government did not want to involve us in the planning. Now, on your show late last year, Mr Andrews, when he announced the plan for North East Link, said that he hoped that the federal government would provide funding. You know, we've not received any documentation on that, John. So I would say to the Andrews government, give us the documentation so that we can then decide whether we're going to have an involvement. So the Turnbull government stands ready to invest in infrastructure in Victoria and in Melbourne, building on what we're already investing in. We need to engage, and we need the Victorian government to engage with us to work with our principles, such as needing business cases to be assessed by Infrastructure Australia. Every other state and territory government manages to do it. It's puzzling that the Andrews government seems to find it more difficult.
I'll put it to Mr Pallas, the Treasurer, who's listening and will join me in just a moment. A couple of other quick things before we go to the State Treasurer. Should Australia offer sanctuary to white South African farmers, as Peter Dutton says?
Well, can I say I have a lot of Australians of South African background in my electorate, in areas like St Ives and others. They are fantastic Australians. They make a terrific contribution. Now, what Mr Dutton has been saying, of course, is that we have a significant humanitarian visa intake every year, a bit over 18,000, I believe, and that is assessed on the merits of individual cases. Now, he's making the point that in his judgment and on the information available to him, there are South African farmers who are facing threats of violence.
Sure. Without going back over the whole history, what does Paul Fletcher think, yes or no?
Well, what I think is that all of the applicants for humanitarian visas around the world who apply for humanitarian visas in Australia should be considered on their merits.
So we should be colour blind in processing these applications?
We should consider them on their merits.
So you're disagreeing with Peter Dutton, who said white farmers should be given priority?
No, what I'm saying is we have a generous humanitarian visa scheme.
If you're colour blind, then whether they're white or whether they're green is irrelevant. Peter Dutton says it's relevant. You're saying we should not take into account their colour.
When Peter Dutton speaks about the fact that we have a group of people on the evidence available to us who are facing violence and persecution, then those are people who should be able to be considered through our process as any other group of people who are facing violence and persecution should be. That's why we have an assessment of humanitarian visas based on the merits.
Very briefly, Mark Zuckerberg this morning from Facebook has said sorry about the data breach. Do you trust Facebook?
Having been involved in a number of these issues, I did a lot of work when I was Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Communications, then Malcolm Turnbull, on the question of online safety for children, working with organisations like Facebook. I think there's no doubt that they've grown very rapidly and an understanding of their social obligations has come somewhat behind their growth. Minister Mitch Fifield has said that he will be asking the E-Safety Commissioner, which is the body that the Turnbull government has established, to give him some advice in relation to these privacy issues.
Do you trust Facebook?
Well, I think as the expression goes, you need to be careful online. If you're not sure what the product is probably you. So you do need to recognise that you're providing a lot of your personal data, and I'd encourage everybody to think about that and have a cautious attitude to self-preservation on this.
Thank you for your time this morning on all of those issues, and welcome to Melbourne. Paul Fletcher, Federal Minister in the Turnbull Government for Urban Infrastructure. Tim Pallas is the Treasurer